picture it. The city of dreams, of music, of art. A place where history breathes from every cobblestone, where grand imperial palaces stand beside cozy coffee houses. It's a city that prides itself on order, on culture, on a certain refined way of life. And on the outskirts of this beautiful metropolis stands a testament to that order. A sprawling complex of brick and glass, covering acres of land. The Lainz General Hospital. To the people of Vienna, it was more than just a hospital. It was an institution. A city within a city, with its own roads, its own chapels, its own secrets. It was a place you went to be saved, to be healed, to be cared for when you were at your most vulnerable. It was a place built on a foundation of trust, the kind of trust you give to a doctor in a white coat or a nurse with a gentle smile, the kind of trust that says, "Here, I am safe." But trust can be a fragile thing, and sometimes it can be fatally misplaced. Because inside this massive hospital, within one of its many pavilions, was a place that the staff whispered about, a place that doctors tried to avoid, a place that families dreaded. It was officially known as Ward 5, but to those who worked there it had another name, the Death Station. Ward 5 was the geriatric ward, the end of the line. It was where the elderly, the chronically ill, and the terminally infirm were sent when there was nothing else to be done. It was a place of quiet waiting. The air hung thick with the scent of disinfectant and unspoken despair. The silence was deep, punctuated only by the soft shuffle of slippers on linoleum floors, the rhythmic beep of tired machines, and the low constant murmur of the television in the common room. The patients here were forgotten. Their families visited less and less. Their bodies were failing them. Their world had shrunk to the four walls of their room, to the view from their window, to the face of the nurse who brought their morning medication. They were completely and utterly dependent. And for years, something was wrong in Ward 5. Terribly wrong. On paper, it was just a statistic. An anomaly that a diligent administrator might notice, but could easily explain away. The death rate, it was high, unusually high. Even for a ward filled with the elderly and the sick, patients who came in with minor ailments, a broken hip or a treatable infection, would suddenly take a turn, a rapid, inexplicable decline. Healthy one day, gone the next. Doctors would sign the death certificates, listing pneumonia, or heart failure, or organ collapse. Natural causes. It was always natural causes. After all, these people were old. Old people die. It's what they do. The paperwork was filed, the beds were cleaned, and a new patient would arrive to take their place. The cycle continued, quiet and efficient. But the whispers never stopped. Among the hospital staff, stories circulated. A feeling of unease settled over the ward like a shroud. There was a clique of nurses in Ward 5, 4 women. They were different. They ran the ward with an iron fist. They were loud, they were arrogant, and they seemed to enjoy the power they held over their helpless patients. They decided who got extra blankets, who got their meals on time, and who was left to wait. They were a tight-knit group, always together, always whispering in the corners of the nurses' station, sharing dark jokes that made other staff members uncomfortable. At the center of this group was a young nurse's aide. Her name was Waltraud Wagner. She was only in her early 20s, but she carried herself with the authority of a seasoned doctor. She was the ringleader, the queen of Ward 5, and she had a special name for her work, a little phrase she would use when a patient became too demanding, too noisy, or simply too much of a burden. She would turn to one of her followers, a chilling smile playing on her lips, and she would say it, the phrase that would come to define one of the most horrific killing sprees in modern history. She would look at a sleeping patient, an old woman who had perhaps complained about the food, or an old man who had cried out in the night, and she would declare their fate with 4 simple words. This one, she'd say, gets a ticket to God. A ticket to God. It sounded like a joke, a dark, cynical piece of gallows humor, born from the stress and emotional toll of working in such a depressing place. That's what anyone who overheard it would have thought, just a way to cope. But it wasn't a joke. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a death sentence. It was a promise that a patient's life was about to be actively and brutally ended. It was the signal that one of these nurses, these women who had taken an oath to do no harm, was about to commit murder. In a place dedicated to preserving life, how did a group of nurses come to believe they had the divine right to take it away? This is the story of a God complex that festered in the forgotten corners of a hospital, leading to one of history's most prolific killing sprees. It's a story about the absolute corruption of power and what happens when we abandon our most vulnerable to the mercy of monsters disguised as angels. So who is the woman at the center of this storm? Who is this self-appointed angel handing out one-way tickets to the afterlife? When you picture a monster, you imagine something inhuman, a predator with cold, dead eyes. But if you had seen Waltraud Wagner walking the halls of Lainz General Hospital, you wouldn't have looked twice. She was 24 years old, a nurse's aide, plain, unremarkable, just another face in the bustling, anonymous world of a city hospital. And that is precisely what made her so terrifying. Wagner wasn't born a killer. She was made one. Her story begins not in the sterile corridors of a hospital, but in the rustic countryside of Lower Austria. She grew up on a farm, a life of hard work and little recognition. From the very beginning, her life was marked by a quiet, simmering sense of failure. She dreamed of being a nurse, a figure of respect and authority. But the dream remained just out of reach. She tried to enroll in a nursing program at a convent school, but she failed the entrance exam. It was a stinging rejection. Another door slammed shut. So, she took the only path left open to her. She became a Hilfsschwester, a nurse's aide, the lowest rung on the hospital ladder. You have to understand what that meant. A nurse's aide did the work no one else wanted. The cleaning, the lifting, the bedpans. It was a job with all of the responsibility and none of the respect. She was surrounded by doctors who ignored her and head nurses who barked orders at her. For years, Waltraud Wagner was invisible, powerless, a cog in a massive, uncaring machine. And then, she was assigned to Ward 5. And everything changed. In the forgotten world of the geriatric ward, the normal rules didn't seem to apply. The doctors were rarely seen. The head nurses were overworked and exhausted. And the patients were utterly at her mercy. For the first time in her life, Waltraud Wagner had power. Real, tangible power. She could bring comfort with a kind word or misery with a cold shoulder. She controlled their food, their medication, their dignity. The quiet, failed farm girl had found her kingdom. And in this kingdom, she could finally be someone. The first time she killed, she told herself it was an act of mercy. The patient was a 77-year-old woman. She was in pain, her body riddled with disease. Wagner saw her suffering, or at least, that's the story she would later tell. One night, she prepared a syringe of morphine, a dose far stronger than what was prescribed. She approached the old woman's bedside, her heart likely pounding in her chest. A single, decisive act, a quiet injection, and then, stillness. She had done it. She had ended a life. She had stepped across a line from which there is no return. She would claim that in that moment she felt she was freeing the woman from her pain, a merciful angel. But what she truly discovered was not mercy. It was control, the ultimate control. In a life defined by powerlessness, she had just wielded the ultimate power. She had played God, and she liked it. That first act opened a floodgate. The justification of mercy quickly eroded, replaced by a chilling sense of entitlement. Wagner became the self-appointed superintendent of the ward, the judge, jury, and executioner. She decided who was worthy of living and who was a burden, a patient who complained too much, a patient who was incontinent, a patient who simply annoyed her. They were all candidates for a ticket to God. But a queen cannot rule alone. And Wagner had a gift for spotting weakness, for finding the cracks in other people's personalities and prying them open. She began to assemble her court, her flock. First, there was Irene Lainz, 42 years old, a fully qualified nurse and a recent divorcee. She was older, more experienced, but also lonely and looking for a sense of belonging. Wagner's charismatic, take-charge personality was like a magnet. Lainz quickly became her devoted deputy, her right-hand woman. She saw Wagner's confidence not as arrogance, but as strength. She bought into the twisted logic of the ward completely. She became the loyal enforcer of Wagner's deadly decrees. Then came the followers. Stefania Meyer, a 50-year-old Yugoslavian immigrant. She was an outsider, someone who perhaps struggled to fit in. Wagner offered her inclusion, a place in the most powerful clique in the ward. Meyer was eager to please, eager to be accepted. She followed orders without question. And finally, there was Maria Gruber, the youngest of the group, just 19 years old, inexperienced, impressionable, and likely terrified of the domineering Wagner. She was swept up in the group's dark momentum, a follower caught in a cult she couldn't escape. Make no mistake, this was not a partnership of equals. It was a tyranny. Picture them in the nurse's break room, bathed in the harsh fluorescent light. Wagner is at the center of it all, leaning back in her chair, a cigarette in hand. She's telling a story, laughing, and the other three are hanging on her every word. Lainz is nodding along, adding details. Meyer and Gruber are smiling, eager to be part of the inner circle. In this room, they weren't just nurses. They were a secret society, bound by a horrific pact. Wagner would identify a target. She would pass the sentence, and her followers would help carry it out. They created a chillingly casual system. They called their method of murder the water cure. It was a slow, torturous process that would leave almost no trace. One nurse would hold the patient's head and pinch their nose shut, forcing their mouth open to gasp for air. Another would pour water down a tube or directly into their throat. The water would flood their lungs. It was, in effect, a drowning on dry land. The death certificate would later read pneumonia or pulmonary edema, a natural death. No one would ever suspect. They were caregivers. They were killers. They would fluff a patient's pillow one moment and suffocate them the next. They would share a kind word with a visiting family in the afternoon and murder their loved one in the dead of night. This chilling duality became their new normal. The ward was their stage, and they were the directors of a play where they held the power of life and death in their hands. Wagner and her flock had the will. They had the desire to kill. But to turn that desire into a factory of death, they needed something more. They needed the perfect hunting ground, a place where the victims were invisible and the system was blind. And in the hopeless, forgotten world of Ward 5, they found it. A predator needs the right environment to thrive. A shark needs the ocean. A wolf needs the forest. And for Waltraud Wagner, her perfect hunting ground was a place the rest of the world had decided to forget. It was called Pavilion 5. To understand how 4 nurses became a death squad, you have to understand the world they inhabited every single day. Pavilion 5 wasn't just a ward in a hospital. It was an island, a remote outpost of suffering, cut off from the hope and healing that filled the rest of Lainz General. It was a place where the hospital's most difficult cases were sent to be managed, not cured. The elderly, the senile, the chronically ill, the patients with no families left to advocate for them. They were, in the cold institutional language of the hospital, social cases, burdens. Imagine walking into this ward on a bleak Tuesday afternoon. The first thing that hits you is the smell. A heavy, cloying mix of antiseptic, stale food, and sickness. The light from the tall, barred windows seems weak, as if it can't quite pierce the gloom. The linoleum floors are scuffed and worn from the endless shuffle of feet and the rolling of gurneys. The walls, painted a pale institutional green, are bare, save for a few faded generic prints of flowers. There is no life here, no vibrancy, just a profound, soul-crushing sense of waiting. This wasn't a place of recovery. It was a human warehouse, and it was chronically, dangerously understaffed. On any given shift, a handful of nurses and aides were responsible for dozens of patients, many of whom required constant, intensive care. The call buttons would blink endlessly, unanswered. The cries for help would fade into the background noise of the ward. The doctors, the ultimate authority in any hospital, were ghosts here. They would make their morning rounds, a fleeting visit, signing charts and renewing prescriptions before quickly moving on to other wards where their skills were considered more valuable, where the patients had a better chance of getting well. The message from the hospital administration, unspoken but crystal clear, was this: these patients do not matter. They were a drain on resources. They were occupying beds that could be used for younger, more salvageable patients. Their lives had been devalued not just by their failing bodies, but by the very system that was supposed to care for them. This systemic neglect created a power vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped well-trod Wagner and her followers. With the doctors absent and the head nurses overwhelmed, Wagner's clique became the de facto rulers of Pavilion 5. They were the ones there day in and day out. They were the ones who held the real power. The power to soothe a patient or to ignore them. The power to bring a meal on time or to let it grow cold. The power over every intimate, humiliating detail of their patient's final days. And in this bleak, hopeless environment, a twisted new ideology began to take root. Wagner started to see herself not as a failed aide, but as a vital, powerful force. She wasn't just cleaning up after the sick and dying. She was managing them. She was solving problems. And the biggest problem in her eyes was the patients themselves. They were messy. They were loud. They were an inconvenience. So, the murders began. At first, she probably wrapped them in the comforting blanket of justification, mercy. She would target the patients who were in the most pain, the ones who were clearly terminal. She would tell herself and her followers that she was doing them a favor. She was an angel of mercy, ending their suffering, helping them along to a better place. It was a seductive lie. It transformed a horrific act into a noble one. It turned a murderer into a savior. And the system was her silent accomplice. Every time one of their patients died, it wasn't a tragedy. It was a success. It was one less mouth to feed, one less body to clean. It was an empty bed. An empty bed meant a problem had been solved. The doctors, when they signed the death certificates, never looked too closely. Pneumonia, heart failure, old age. The causes of death were always plausible, and the paperwork was always in order. No one asked the hard questions. No one wanted to. Because deep down, the deaths in Pavilion 5 were seen as inevitable and even convenient. This constant reinforcement warped their sense of reality. Every murder they got away with proved their point. They were in control. They were untouchable. Their judgment was superior to that of the doctors, to that of the hospital, even to that of God himself. The initial justification of mercy began to rot away, revealing the ugly truth beneath. They weren't ending suffering. They were exercising power. They began to kill for sport. A patient who complained about the food might find themselves on Wagner's list. An old man who snored too loudly might earn himself a ticket to God. A woman who repeatedly soiled her bed became a problem to be eliminated, not a patient to be cared for. They would sit in the break room and discuss their patients not as people, but as objects. They would laugh about their infirmities. They would decide, over coffee and cigarettes, who would live and who would die. Their God complex was no longer a secret psychological tic. It was a fully formed operational philosophy. They were the cleaners, the janitors of life. And Pavilion 5 was their workshop. They were not just a product of their own evil. They were a symptom of a much larger disease. A disease of neglect, of apathy, of a society that had decided that some lives are worth less than others. The forgotten ward became their sanctuary, a place where the normal rules of morality and law simply didn't exist. It was a place where their darkest impulses were not only tolerated, but, in a twisted way, rewarded. The ward was supposed to be a place of care. Instead, it became a laboratory, a place where 4 women could test the limits of their own cruelty, with a steady supply of human subjects that no one would ever miss. And with every successful murder, every unquestioned death certificate, their confidence grew into a monstrous arrogance. They were no longer just nurses, they were the masters of life and death, and they were just getting started. Power, once tasted, is a difficult drug to quit. For Waltraud Wagner and her followers, the grim, neglected corridors of Ward 5 had become their own private empire. And in this empire, they were empresses. But their power wasn't just in the authority they held during the day. Their true power was unleashed in the deep, suffocating silence of the night. Imagine the scene. It's 3 a.m. The sprawling city of Vienna is asleep. Inside Pavilion 5, the only light is the pale, ghostly glow from the nurses' station, casting long, distorted shadows down the hallway. The only sound is the gentle, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping patients. They are at their most vulnerable, old, frail, and lost in their dreams, trusting that the uniformed figures walking the halls are there to protect them. But tonight, 2 of those figures are not protectors. They are hunters. They move with a practiced silence, their soft-soled shoes making no sound on the worn floor. They bypass the rooms of patients they deem worthy of life and stop at a specific door. Inside, an old woman sleeps. Perhaps she had been difficult earlier, refusing to eat her dinner. Perhaps she had cried out for a family member who was no longer there. Or perhaps she had done nothing at all. Her crime was simply being old, sick, and in their way. The nurses enter the room. They don't speak. They don't need to. Every movement is choreographed, a routine they have perfected through grim repetition. One of them, perhaps Irene Lydolf, stands at the head of the bed. The other, maybe Wagner herself, stands beside it, holding a small pitcher of water from the nightstand. This was their signature creation, their preferred instrument of death. They called it, with a chillingly sterile name, the water cure. It was a method of murder as brutal as it was brilliant. Brilliant because it was almost impossible to trace. It required no weapon, no poison from the drug cabinet that might be missed. It used only the most basic elements of care: a pitcher of water, a nurse's hands. The first nurse gently places a hand on the sleeping woman's head, as if to comfort her. But then, the grip tightens. A thumb and forefinger pinch the woman's nostrils shut. The patient, startled from her sleep, would instinctively gasp for air through her mouth. A reflex. A desperate biological need. And in that exact moment, the second nurse would act. The pitcher is tilted. A steady stream of cold water is poured directly into the woman's open, gasping mouth. There is no escape. The water bypasses the esophagus and floods the airway. The patient begins to drown. On dry land. In their own hospital bed. Their body would convulse, their lungs burning, fighting. For 6 years, the angels of death operated in the shadows. 6 years of murder, hidden in plain sight. They had built a fortress of arrogance, believing themselves to be utterly untouchable. They had outsmarted doctors, administrators, and even death itself. In their minds, they were not criminals. They were gods, and gods do not get caught. But there is an old saying, pride comes before the fall. And for Waltraud Wagner and her followers, their fall from grace wouldn't be triggered by a brilliant detective or a forensic breakthrough. It would be triggered by something far more mundane. A round of drinks at a local tavern. Picture the scene. It's February 1989. A cozy, wood-paneled pub not far from the hospital. The kind of place where doctors and nurses go to unwind after a long, grueling shift. The air is thick with the smell of stale beer and fried food. Laughter and conversation echo off the walls. At a corner table, a young doctor sits alone nursing a drink, trying to forget the stresses of the day. And then he hears them, a group of women at a nearby table. He recognizes them as nurses from Lainz. They are loud, boisterous, and several drinks in, and they are laughing, a deep, unrestrained laughter that cuts through the noise of the pub. He tries to ignore them, but their words drift over, and what he hears makes the blood run cold in his veins. They are talking about their work, but they aren't complaining about difficult patients or long hours. They are bragging about a recent death on their ward. Specifically, the death of an elderly patient named geriatric. They are laughing about how she met her maker. One of the nurses, emboldened by alcohol and arrogance, raises her glass in a toast. To our latest, she slurs, another ticket to God, courtesy of me. The doctor is frozen. It can't be. It has to be a sick joke, a piece of morbid gallows humor. Nurses, especially those who work with the terminally ill, often develop a dark sense of humor to cope. It's a defense mechanism. But this felt different. There was a cruelty in their laughter, a glint of pride in their eyes that went far beyond a simple coping mechanism. He watches them, his mind racing. He thinks back to all the whispers, all the rumors about the unusually high death rate in Pavilion 5. He thinks of the patients he had seen, seemingly stable one day, and inexplicably gone the next. For years, everyone had dismissed it. It was just an anomaly. Bad luck. But now, listening to these women, a horrifying new possibility begins to take shape in his mind. He leaves the tavern, the nurse's laughter echoing in his ears. He knows he can't ignore what he heard. He has a choice to make. He can dismiss it as drunken rambling, go back to his life and forget the whole thing. Or he can do something that could potentially destroy his career, brand him as a troublemaker, and make him an enemy of some very popular nurses. He makes the call. The next day, a formal report is filed with the Vienna police. It is a tentative, almost apologetic report. A doctor, who wishes to remain anonymous, claims to have overheard a suspicious conversation. He admits it could be nothing, but he feels it's his duty to report it. The police understandably are skeptical. A group of nurses bragging in a pub? It sounded like a misunderstanding, but they were obligated to look into it. And so, a quiet, almost routine investigation begins. The first thing the police do is pull the file of the deceased patient, geriatric. On the surface, everything looks normal. She was elderly, in poor health. The cause of death was listed as natural causes. The paperwork was immaculate. The case was a dead end. But the seed of suspicion had been planted. The police decide to dig deeper. They start conducting discreet interviews with other staff members at Lainz. And slowly, a picture begins to emerge. A picture of 4 nurses who ruled their ward like a personal fiefdom. A picture of fear, intimidation, and a disturbing pattern of sudden deaths. Staff members, who had been too afraid to speak up before, begin to talk. They talk about the clique's arrogance, they talk about their strange jokes. They talk about the patients who seemed to die right after having a conflict with one of the 4 women. The evidence is circumstantial. It's all just hearsay. But it's enough. The police now have probable cause. On April 7, 1989, they make their move. Waltraud Wagner is working the morning shift when 2 plainclothes detectives walk onto the ward. They approach her at the nurse's station. They are calm, professional. They ask her to come with them, just to answer a few questions. Wagner, supremely confident, agrees. She probably thinks it's a routine inquiry, a minor bureaucratic hurdle. She has gotten away with murder for 6 years. A few questions from a couple of city detectives is nothing. She was wrong. At the police station, the questioning begins. It is relentless. The detectives confront her with the stories, the whispers, the timeline of deaths. Wagner denies everything. She is calm, collected, and arrogant. She dismisses the accusations as the jealous ramblings of her colleagues. But then, the detectives make a breakthrough. They arrest the other three nurses, Irene, Stefania, and Maria, and they interrogate them separately. And under the bright, unforgiving lights of the interrogation room, away from the magnetic, controlling influence of their leader, the cult begins to crumble. Maria Gruber, the youngest and most impressionable, is the first to break. She confesses. She tells the police everything. About the water cure, about the overdoses, about the chilling, casual decisions to end a patient's life. With Gruber's confession, the dam breaks. The other two quickly follow, each one trying to minimize their own role and place the blame squarely on Wagner. The police now have everything they need. They go back to Wagner, and they lay it all out on the table. The confessions of her followers, the details of the murders, the truth. And in that moment, something inside Waltraud Wagner snaps. The mask of the caring, professional nurse finally shatters, and the monster beneath is revealed. She doesn't just confess, she boasts. She leans back in her chair, a proud, defiant smile on her face, and she begins to list her victims. She claims responsibility for the death of Julia Druppal. She admits to dozens of other murders. She tells the police with a chilling lack of remorse that she only killed patients who deserved it. The detectives are stunned. They have never seen anything like it. This isn't a remorseful killer, broken by guilt. This is a predator, proud of her work. Over the next few days, the full, horrifying scale of their crimes becomes clear. Wagner's initial confession of a few dozen murders is just the beginning. She eventually claims to have had a hand in the deaths of over 100 patients, though she can't remember all of their names. The police, based on the timeline and the suspicious deaths, believe the true number could be as high as 200. The angels of death had been unmasked. The news explodes across Austria and then the world. The story is a media sensation. The public is horrified, captivated, and utterly bewildered. How could this have happened? In a modern hospital in a civilized city, the fortress of arrogance had crumbled. The reign of terror in Ward 5 was over. But the trial and the dark questions it would raise about the very systems we trust to protect us was just about to begin. The arrests were made. The confessions were signed. The horrifying truth was finally out in the open. But the story was far from over. Because now, the angels of death had to face the one power they could not control, the one judgment they could not manipulate. They had to face the world. The trial of the four nurses began in March of 1991, and it was nothing short of a media circus. The case had gripped the nation of Austria and the world by the throat. It was a story that seemed ripped from the pages of a gothic horror novel, not the daily records of a modern, respected hospital. The courtroom was packed every single day with journalists, psychologists, and a public hungry for answers, desperate to understand the incomprehensible. And at the center of it all, in the defendant's dock, sat the four women. But they were not the fearsome, domineering figures who had ruled Pavilion 5. Stripped of their uniforms, their authority, and their power, they looked ordinary, small, pathetic even. Stefania Meyer and Maria Gruber, the followers, often sat with their heads bowed, avoiding the cold glare of the cameras. Irene Lydolf, the loyal deputy, appeared nervous, her confident demeanor shattered. But Waltraud Wagner was different. Even here on trial for her life, she radiated an unnerving, defiant arrogance. She would look out at the courtroom, a faint, condescending smirk playing on her lips. She seemed to enjoy the attention, the infamy. This was her grandest stage yet, and she was the star of the show. She was no longer just the queen of a forgotten ward. She was the most notorious woman in Austria. The prosecution began, and the courtroom listened in stunned silence as the full, systematic horror of their crimes was laid bare. They detailed 42 specific murders, though they acknowledged that this was likely just a fraction of the true total. They presented the evidence, the falsified records, the testimony of other hospital staff, and most damningly, the nurses' own chilling confessions. The prosecutor's case was simple, brutal, and clear. This was not mercy. This was not the act of overworked nurses cracking under pressure. This was a systematic campaign of torture and murder, driven by a thirst for power and a sadistic contempt for human life. The defense, faced with a mountain of their client's own words, had an almost impossible task. They tried to paint a picture of a broken system. They argued that Lainz General Hospital, and specifically Pavilion 5, was a place of unbearable stress and hopelessness. They portrayed the four women not as monsters, but as victims of that system, overworked, undersupported, and emotionally shattered by the constant presence of death. Their actions, the defense argued, were a twisted, misguided attempt to bring peace to the suffering. They were not murders, they were acts of pity. But that defense began to crumble every time Waltraud Wagner opened her mouth. When she took the stand, any notion of a mercy killer evaporated. She was unapologetic. She was cold. She spoke of her victims with a chilling detachment, as if they were tasks on a to-do list that she had efficiently completed. She told the court, with a straight face, that she felt she had the right to decide who lived and who died. She said she was simply clearing beds and freeing patients from what she deemed to be undignified lives. She looked the judges in the eye and essentially confessed to playing God, not as a crime, but as a job she had taken upon herself. Her testimony was not a defense. It was a confirmation of her monstrous God complex. She showed no remorse, no guilt, no humanity. The trial lasted for weeks, and in the end, the verdict was never really in doubt. In March of 1991, the judgment came down. Waltraud Wagner, the ringleader, the superintendent of death, was found guilty of 15 murders, 17 attempted murders, and 2 counts of assault. She was sentenced to life in prison. Irene Leidolf, her loyal deputy, was also found guilty of murder and received a life sentence. The 2 followers, Stefania Meyer and Maria Gruber, received lesser sentences for their roles, convicted of manslaughter and accessory to murder. The court recognized that while they were killers, they were also acting under the powerful coercive influence of their leader. Justice, it seemed, had been served. The monsters were caged. But the story doesn't end there, because the trial of the 4 nurses had exposed a much deeper, more terrifying sickness. The public was left with a burning question. 4 women had been convicted, yes. But were they the only ones to blame? How, in God's name, could a killing spree of this magnitude go on for 6 years in a major hospital completely undetected? The case sent a shockwave of terror and shame through the heart of Austrian society. It forced a painful, long overdue reckoning with how the country treated its most vulnerable citizens. The Lainz case wasn't just about a few rogue nurses. It was about a system that had allowed them to flourish, a system that devalued the elderly, that underfunded geriatric care, and that created environments so hopeless and neglected that a God complex like Wagner's could take root and grow into a murderous weed. The public outcry was immense. The hospital's administration was accused of gross negligence. The entire Austrian healthcare system was put under a microscope. And this time, things had to change. In the wake of the trial, sweeping reforms were enacted. New laws were passed, establishing powerful, independent advocates for patients' rights within hospitals. Protocols for monitoring unexpected deaths were completely overhauled. Staffing levels in geriatric wards were increased. A new emphasis was placed on palliative care, on providing dignity and comfort to the dying, not just warehousing them until they disappeared. The case of the Lainz Angels of Death became a grim but powerful catalyst for change. The women themselves would not remain behind bars forever. Due to changes in Austrian law and a system that favored rehabilitation, all 4 were eventually released, having served out their sentences. They faded back into society, living quiet lives under new names. But the legacy of their actions, and the ward they turned into a slaughterhouse, lingers. The case serves as a permanent, chilling reminder. The Lainz Angels of Death were convicted, but the trial exposed a deeper sickness. It revealed how easily the vulnerable can be preyed upon when a system designed to protect them looks the other way. Their God complex was born in the shadows of neglect, a terrifying reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones to whom we grant our absolute trust. The questions raised by the Lainz case are as relevant today as they were decades ago. How do we protect the vulnerable? And how do we ensure accountability in the systems we trust? Exploring these difficult questions is at the core of what we do. If you find this kind of deep dive storytelling valuable, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sharing this video helps spread awareness and supports our mission to uncover the truth. And now we want to hear from you. Comment below with another case you believe the world needs to hear about. We are always listening. Thank you for joining us in the search for answers.